And speaking of your friendly right-wing newspapers, it is frankly astonishing how long people can keep the ball in the air about why you should all be terrified about refugees and asylum seekers without mentioning that by voting for Brexit in 2016, you made it immeasurably harder for the UK government to send failed asylum seekers back to other European countries. That's not an opinion, by the way, that's counting. Under the Dublin Agreement, which we ceased to be part of on January the 1st of this year, we sent 2015, let's choose, the year before the referendum, 510 failed asylum seekers were sent back to other European countries. And even in 2020, the number was 105. You'll be aware that so far this year, I think the number is 5. So Nigel Farage, Priti Patel, Digby Pudding-Jones, all the rest of them encouraged you to vote to make it harder to send failed asylum seekers back to other countries. Now, I'm not a big fan of deportations. Unlike Nigel Farage and Priti Patel, my ancestors didn't come here as refugees, but nevertheless, my humanity extends to these desperate people. But if you are unpersuaded of their shared humanity or unpersuaded of the importance of common decency, Christian values, one might even say, you must be absolutely spitting nails. The people that told you had to vote for Brexit because you had a real problem with immigration, whether legal or not, have actually made it harder to send failed asylum seekers back to other European countries. And if you're wondering why this is the first you've heard of it on this programme, well, it's because the people that told you to vote for Brexit can't. They didn't understand what they were doing. They didn't realise what it would involve. And the last thing they're going to do is put their hands up and say, oh, I'm so sorry. When I encouraged you to vote for Brexit, I had no idea that withdrawing from the Dublin Agreement would actually make it immeasurably harder for us to, whether you are in favour of deportations or not, it's going to be immeasurably harder for us to actually do it. It's almost as if they didn't have the first idea what they were talking about, even when it came to immigration, which, let's be honest, by the end, was all they ever talked about. Oh, and obviously we still have massive shortages in just about every imaginable sector, shortages which in comparison with other countries also suffering from shortages are much bigger and much worse. Indeed, the only thing we don't have a shortage of at the moment in this country is, altogether now, shortages. Andrew Rosindell is an MP. Do you know, off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you where he stood on the Brexit issue, but I'll take a wild guess. He is a Member of Parliament, as you will be aware, or as you may not be aware, Member of Parliament for Romford in Essex. And he has been, he's always quick with a quote for the media. And I've got 2 quotes he's given, which I think are absolutely fascinating. You know how often we stare at the news on this programme, trying to work out what is really going on, whether it's in an issue-based conversation or whether it is the broader picture of politics. Today, looking at HS2, looking at the abandonment of huge swathes of the north by the current government. We're trying to work out how they thought they could get away with it. I think the answer that we've come up with works. They just don't think enough people are going to care. Quentin Rayner is a freelance journalist who's just tweeted, it's being suggested by James O'Brien that the decision to scrap the other phases of HS2 is because the government thinks people don't care enough about it. I once carried out Vox Pops at Leicester Station and was staggered by how few passengers had even heard of HS2. So, possibly today our attempt to answer a complicated question has been successful. Certainly Nigel Harris, who is the managing editor of Rail magazine and provided us with proper expert analysis not long ago, has taken to Twitter to reveal an astonishing uptick in the number of people following him. He suggests that maybe ordinary, decent folk just want to be better informed, an audience so poorly served by the MSM on rail matters. It fits quite nicely. How are they going to get away with this? Answer, we didn't realise what an egregious offence it was. But let me steer you back to Andrew Rosindell and that abiding question of what do they actually stand for. I think we might have come fairly close to an explanation. Now, do you remember when the government voted to remove the £20 extra that the poorest people in the country were in receipt of. That was £20 on top of universal credit. And a fairly obvious objection to that was based on two things. Number one was that a significant proportion of people on universal credit were in work, so the old-fashioned line about lazy, feckless layabouts, although deeply dishonest, didn't even work here because people in full-time work were going to lose 20 quid a week. The poorest people in the country, I'm just going to keep saying that. In fact, I'm going to say it 3 times. They voted to take away £20 a week from the poorest people in the country. The poorest people in the country were told by this government to survive on £20 less, even less than they had already. The Conservative government instructed its MPs to vote to remove £20 a week from the poorest people in the country. And here is the MP for Romford explaining why.
I think that this is a balance. It has to be judged very carefully. I think there are people that quite like getting the extra £20, but maybe they don't need it.
Okay, you got that, yeah? So the poorest people in the country, I'm going to say that again, the poorest people in the country maybe don't need £20 a week more. Now, Andy has also been waxing lyrical upon the question of how MPs can possibly be expected to survive on a mere 80-odd grand a year, because the slightly fudged attempt to limit the second jobs that can be done passed in Parliament yesterday. I don't think it's got many teeth, for the record, the legislation as it stands, but the journey is not over yet. January is Judgment Day. But Andrew Rosindell, the MP for Romford, who thinks that taking £20 a week off the poorest people in the country was a great idea because they didn't really need it, has also been waxing lyrical on the issue of preventing MPs from trousering epic sums of money from private sector companies for services rendered.
I'm very cautious on this because I know that some of my colleagues have jobs and outside work that they do, and that means them having to give up changing their lifestyle. We have to be careful about this. We have to realise that we're dealing with human beings who have families and responsibilities.
Right, I'm going to play you the first clip again. This is Andrew Rosindell, the MP for Romford, talking about the withdrawal of £20 a week from the pockets and the purses of the poorest people in this country.
I think that this is a balance. It has to be judged very carefully. I think there are people that quite like getting the extra £20, but maybe they don't need it.
And this is the same MP talking about people in the same country who operate under the same currency, but who currently are free to, in the case of Geoffrey Cox, earn about £1 million a year doing work on the side, or in the case of Ian Duncan Smith, to take 25 grand a year from a hand sanitizer company, or in the case of Owen Patterson, 100 grand a year from Rand. I could go on. But this is the same man who thinks the poorest people in the country don't need £20 a week, talking about why his colleagues in the House of Commons, on in excess of £80,000 a year, are, well, human beings.
I'm very cautious on this because I know that some of my colleagues have jobs and outside work that they do, and that means them having to give up changing their lifestyle. We have to be careful about this. We have to realise that we're dealing with human beings who have families and responsibilities.
Oh, once more then. Go on. Because what we're dealing with in the second case is human beings who have families and responsibilities, all right? That's Conservative MPs earning epic sums of money for unspecified service to private sector companies. But human beings who have families and responsibilities and are among the poorest people in the country, this is what he thinks of them.
I think that this is a balance. It has to be judged very carefully. I think there are people that quite like getting the extra £20, but maybe they don't need it.
And now you know precisely who Andrew Rosindell, the MP for Romford, cares about, represents and worries about at night. He currently has a majority of 17,893. So if you don't like the cut of his jib or the idea that you should care about human beings who are Conservative MPs, but the poorest people in the country can easily absorb a £20 cut in their income, then you can demonstrate your unhappiness at the next election.